What if RFID actually worked the way warehouse teams expect it to? Sonaria delivers RFID without friction with simple, operator-friendly workflows that drive fast business results. Warehouse workers want clear and intuitive user interfaces. Sonaria delivers that with practical and direct solutions. Learn how warehouse executives are cutting manual work, trusting inventory again, and improving KPIs without burdening the floor at sonaria.com. That's SONARIA.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, we are going to talk about something that is a necessity for the warehousing industry, facilities and development and the market around those facilities and what's happening. And in particular, we're going to dive into how kind of the increase in technology within the warehousing environment is impacting some of those facilities and adjusting maybe a little bit what people are looking for when they look for a new facility, and how that's impacting some of the older warehouses that we see out there as well. Even though this is the New Warehouse Podcast, we still got love for the old warehouses too. So joining me today to discuss this is going to be Blake Chroman. He is the principal at Sitex Group, and he's in New Jersey, just like me. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and what he's seeing out there and kind of what's been developing in the market. So Blake, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be on. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well too. So you're the principal over at Sitex Group. So tell us a little bit about Sitex and what it is that you all do.
Okay, great. Thank you. So in a nutshell, Sitex Group owns industrial real estate throughout New Jersey, New York, and South Florida. Some people know us from sort of way back when, where the company was started, more than 20 years ago in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So once upon a time, we had a pretty sizable portfolio of industrial properties in Chicago and even Southern California. But over the last, let's call it 10 years, we sort of did a pivot, and our portfolio is largely comprised of industrial assets in New York, New Jersey, South Florida. We primarily buy existing assets, call them, B plus, A minus assets, and look to add value to them to kind of make them a better version of themselves. And then, of course, go to lease them out if they're not already leased. We add value through financing, through construction activities, through leasing, et cetera. And then, a smaller portion of what we do, but still a meaningful portion of what we do, is built from the ground up. Mm-hmm. And in places like New Jersey, as you know, Kevin, there's not a lot of greenfield land. Sure. And so a lot of times development really means redevelopment. So you're buying some older property that is in many cases decades old and redeveloping it or repurposing it for the next phase of its life.
Interesting. And certainly, you mentioned New Jersey specifically. I mean, there's always seems to be a ton of warehouses going up, right? And seeing that, and where I grew up is a lot of farmland that has now become warehouse land, essentially, and very interesting to see that. So I guess tell us, we're recording this year now, like at the end of 2025, right? So tell us a little bit about kind of like, what are you seeing from some of the development side in the market in general? Like what are you seeing the current market kind of looks like?
Sure. So from my vantage point, from my sort of point of view, there's been, and I think you know this, and I think all of your listeners probably know this, there has been in New Jersey and many other places, there's been, a ton of new development over the last, 5 or 7 years. You just referenced it in places in New Jersey that are sort of the norm for industrial development at the key interchanges off the turnpike, let's say. But then in a lot of cases, in places that have not been the norm, in places that, it's sort of new to have industrial real estate now. So many of these projects got approved from an entitlements perspective and then got built. And I guess I would say, unfortunately, and I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I'm optimistic about the industrial real estate market, but I also call balls and strikes. And there are still a bunch of these buildings that are available. I think you know this. We all kind of know this from driving around. We see the available for lease sign, CBRE, whatever it is. So that is just starting to change from my perspective. And these buildings are getting, absorbed. I think a lot of people that I talk to, and maybe some people that you talk to as well, market participants, whether they're brokers, investors, developers, or end user occupiers, will tell you that during the 18 or 24 months at the heart of the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, there was like virtually no space available. Everybody needed it. Nobody can get their hands on it. Companies wanted, short-term deals just to kind of get through what was going on at the time. And they ended up signing whatever kinds of leases the landlords needed them to sign in many cases, just because it was sort of a supply-demand sort of imbalance. Coming out of that, things have been normalizing. I know a lot of market participants feel like, oh, geez, it's just slow. It's not great. To me, this is more of a normal market. I think the people that are saying that are kind of looking back to from the middle of 2020 to 2022, when things were going gangbusters in our industry. And they're looking at the conditions now, and there's vacancy and rents have softened a little bit. Concessions have come up. And people are like, it's a little slow. I happen to think it's a normalizing market. And I think competition is good, for landlords to compete for tenants, that is. So I guess high level, and the other thing I would add to that, if I may, is the new pipeline or the pipeline of new construction now has really slowed down for a couple of reasons, in my opinion, or at least the way that I see it. One is, you still have this kind of hangover of supply that was built over the last 5 or 7 years that we talked about.
Okay.
And the second thing is there's been geopolitical concerns, economic concerns, interest rate concerns, all kinds of concerns that have been enough to sort of put the brakes on getting new projects out of the ground. And on top of that, at least from my perspective, the municipal approval or entitlement process has gotten, increasingly tougher. And I think that's because so many of these warehouses were approved and built. And again, I'm pro-industrial, pro-warehouse. I'm not saying they shouldn't be. I want them to be. But so many projects got approved by certain towns that I think that, it's just tougher to get these newer projects approved these days in certain municipalities. So there's sort of been a confluence of factors that have slowed down the development pipeline, And so while there's still vacancy out there as we drive by these buildings that are vacant, I see that changing. And in the next 1 to 2 years, I do see most of them, if not all of them, being absorbed. And then you're going to hear complaints about how there's no supply, So it's just funny what people, complain about and when and how secular this world is.
Yeah. Everything's a cycle, right?
It's all a cycle. It's all a cycle. So
for sure,
we're actually looking, and I don't want to talk our own book, but we're actually looking at development sites right now because I think that it's a little bit less competitive. Still a very competitive marketplace, but I think it's a little bit less competitive because you have some developers that are on the sidelines right now because they've got some legacy vacancy that they need to get leased before they can put a shovel in the ground for the next 1, 2, 5 projects. So we're looking at these sites now as maybe we have a little bit less competition than we did over the last 5 or 7 years.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting too that you pointed out that, so many of these projects got approved, right? And now they're kind of like clamping down a little bit, almost in a sense, because I see it around New Jersey and in particular, some of these small towns where, there was no real industrial before, and then they kind of almost opened the floodgates in a sense, right? And now residents are upset, right? And I see the signs, stop the warehouses, stop the trucks, and all these things. And it's such an interesting discussion, I think, because it's kind of the residents are no, we don't want to see the warehouse. We don't want to hear the trucks or see the trucks.
Right.
But then the residents are the consumer, which is also
right. I want my Legos. I want my Legos delivered the next day.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like also driving why these warehouses are coming closer to you. Right. So it's a very interesting kind of climate and debate there. But interesting to hear that, and interesting to hear kind of like the slowdown in development a little bit, but still potential opportunity within that. So I'm curious within the development and kind of just overall buildings that are out there, right? We talk a lot about newer technologies and things on this podcast that are becoming available and becoming more prevalent within warehouse spaces themselves, and obviously with more technology and things, the requirements that you need from a infrastructure perspective or support perspective of that building start to change a little bit and start to become a little more intensive or higher requirements to do that. So I'm curious, like, what have you seen from that perspective as people are looking for new facilities or searching for facilities? Like, how have the requirements of what they're looking for to support some of that technology changed?
So great question. Again, from my point of view, I'm seeing that the electrical service especially has become one of the sort of key leasing variables for, at least the big box distribution and fulfillment centers, if not even the smaller format buildings. So I have a lot to say on the subject, but I guess where I'll take it from here is, I think all utilities, I think, have become sort of more important in general, not for every building and certainly not for every user. We know that, but just writ large across the board, it's not an afterthought, at least in my opinion, the way that it used to be. It's become sort of at the forefront of the occupiers, what they're asking about, what's important to them. Again, not everybody. Typically, it's the companies, at least again, from my point of view, it's the companies that the ones that are looking for larger format distribution facilities, the ones that are going to make an investment in automation and or climate control and or specialty HVAC and or EV charging. Those companies need more than average amounts of power. And from what I've seen in my career, the larger larger format distribution buildings would have 1,000 amps or 1,500 amps. Now I think, and I see the standard going to like 2,000 to 3,000 amps, and then certain types of users needing even more than that, 4,000 plus. Again, I'm talking about the larger format buildings. Let me pivot for a moment and then kind of come back if you don't mind. Our company, we don't own a lot of million square foot buildings. Most of the buildings we own, in fact, all of them at the moment, are 500,000 square feet or less. And we do own a fair amount of small bay spaces. So just for your audience to picture, like a 100,000 square foot rectangle divided into 10 units or so. We own a lot of those as well. And even in those small and medium sized spaces, power capacity has been more and more of a question. And it's sort of interesting, as more of the end users are looking for spaces that have more power or climate control, specialty HVAC, EV charging. What we're seeing is, because of what these companies need, they are signing longer term leases in some of these cases, because it's tougher to find these buildings, and to go and retrofit an older building that doesn't have some of this infrastructure, utility infrastructure, is very expensive, and it takes a long time, as you may or may not know, to get a power upgrade. A couple of our properties here in North Jersey, in the Meadowlands, and in Middlesex County in Edison, we bought older buildings that were built like in the 60s or 70s. They had just a moderate amount of power, but we ended up leasing them to companies that had an EV network to charge an EV fleet and needed to charge them. It took them about a year to get the approval to upgrade the power, to do the install. And those are the companies, in my opinion, that are willing to sign longer term leases to sort of amortize those investments over a longer period of time. And those types of companies are also asking to do sort of more alterations in an older facility. So I'm kind of going in a couple of different directions, and forgive me for doing that, but there's a lot of implications to this need for power. But I guess if you wanted to sort of simplify it, I think it's safe to say from my vantage point that the newer buildings, the ones that are being built today, developers and investors are being a lot more thoughtful to the power capacity, and not just the amount of capacity it has, but also making space in these buildings or around these buildings for generators, additional transformers, and just general equipment to be able to support whoever comes into these buildings. That's probably the broader point. The new buildings, people are being more thoughtful about power.
Interesting. And you mentioned in there, some of these old buildings as well, right? Because, if we think about, especially in our area, especially like, North Jersey, getting close to New York, right? I mean, it's a high demand area because people want to be close to that population density. But then there's also, a ton of old buildings there because it's been a high demand area for a very long time.
We own many of them. Yes.
Yeah. So how, I mean, maybe, personally for you all, I mean, how are you addressing some of those needs and requirements with the older facilities? And, are you upgrading them as the landlord owner? Are you seeing others do the same, or is it easier in some instances to tear it down and build new? I mean, what's happening there?
Great question. So, and right behind me is an image. I don't know if you can see that. It's an image of the Zuckerberg Industrial Park in Saddlebrook, New Jersey, that we acquired a couple of years ago. It's a bunch of old buildings that are now, leased, but a lot of those companies that have leased those buildings up there have wanted more than the average amount of power. Let me digress for a second. So these older buildings that we own and that you see in North Jersey and throughout the world, right? What are we doing? What are other people doing? We have not upgraded the power in most of the buildings that we've acquired. However, it is one of the things that we're investigating first. And it used to be one of the things that we would investigate last, right? It was, check out the roof, check out the structure, obviously the environmental, we're in New Jersey, check out, all of the sort of key components. Electrical service and just general utility was on the checklist, but I would say last. It's moving up, not first, but it's certainly moving up the list in terms of what we need to diligence, because we're being asked more about it. And it allows us to sort of separate ourselves with this building that we're going to buy relative to the competition if you have a heavier power capacity. So while we're not necessarily upgrading power on spec, we are still waiting for our tenants to tell us what they need. We are upgrading electrical equipment, and so generally we're, updating and upgrading panels and wiring and stuff like that to just, again, make it a better version of itself. But we're not buying a 200,000 foot building in North Bergen and then just on spec upgrading it to like 4,000 amps. We have not done that. But every day is a new day, and that could be, tomorrow. But we have not done that to date. But certainly, even for these older buildings with smaller spaces, companies are asking us, these questions. What do you have there for power? Can you upgrade it? Can it be upgraded? Another sort of tangential point to that is we have bought a couple of buildings over the last 5 years that have solar panels on the roof. And end users, our tenants, have been particularly attracted to those types of buildings, not just for the cost of the power, but for the sort of access to it. Now, every one of those solar panel arrangements is different, as you may know, and I'm certainly not a domain expert on that, but we have bought a number of these buildings, and I was sort of surprised that that sort of helped to add to the mousetrap of some of these buildings versus other buildings that don't have it.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, it's interesting to hear that too, and that kind of evaluation. Now, from I guess from a tenant perspective, right? If they're coming in and they're saying, we need this type of power requirement, and you mentioned the one example where somebody came in and they did all this EV infrastructure to support their fleet. Is that something where you work with them to do that, or it's like on them to kind of figure it out?
Another great question. At the risk of sounding generic, it depends, right? So it depends on who this company is and what the rent is. Generally speaking, it's a negotiation, right? Because it also depends, I hate to say this, on sort of where we are within the market cycle, right? If you've got 3 companies fighting over your building to lease it, and one of them needs a bunch of time and a bunch of money to upgrade the power, but the others don't, it becomes sort of a competitive situation. Generally speaking, I just want to address the question head on. Generally speaking, we try to work with them. Sometimes upgrading the power is not just a tenant-specific improvement, but it's also an improvement to the building, an improvement to the property. So we benefit as well.
Yeah.
So it becomes somewhat of a negotiation where we can make some sort of a contribution, whether that's by way of time or money, and the tenant would sort of make a contribution as well.
Gotcha. Okay.
And it's generally the amount of time. I find the concern on upgrading the power in some of the older buildings, it's more of the time than the money. I'm not saying it's insignificant sums of money, but it could be 6, 9, 12 months before you get the approvals from the utility to do it. And it's like, how many landlords are out there are saying like, yeah, don't worry, we won't sign the lease until, you have these approvals in hand. We can wait the year. Obviously, that doesn't happen very much.
Yeah, it's not that
so that's where the negotiation comes in.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I think very great points from like both sides of the table there, especially like, it makes total sense. Like, hey, if it's going to take you a year to get approval, like I don't necessarily want to keep my building empty for a year. Right.
Right.
And how do we work through that? And I think that negotiation makes sense. And it's good to hear too, that like the perspective of, hey, like, yes, like, this investment is happening. We're going to make this improvement. And, obviously you, the tenant, are going to use it and benefit. But for you, for the long term too, as a developer landlord, like it's kind of like, okay, well, if that tenant moves on and then we go to another tenant, this is like attractive to the next, right? So,
and you would think, I just wanted to, if I can say one more thing, you would think that this kind of a trend or a phenomenon, meaning that it takes, it could take 6, 9, 12 months to get the approvals from the utility to upgrade the power, you would think, or at least I would, that would lead to sort of landlords and tenants making more forward commitments, meaning, hey, Kevin, I want to rent your property, your building. It fits all of our needs, but it's going to take me a year to get the power upgrade. Let's sign a lease now. I'll start spending money as a tenant to upgrade that power now, but the lease doesn't start for a year. Your building is already leased for the next 6 or 9 months. Let's work together to make a forward commitment now that doesn't start for, a year. You would think sort of on the surface that it would lead to those types of things, but obviously that kind of a setup is replete with its own pitfalls because everyone's taking a little bit more risk than maybe they need to, because in a year, the landlord doesn't know if the market's going to be much higher, much lower, et cetera. You don't find that many parties that are willing to make a commitment that doesn't start, out a year. But with this power upgrade thing, you would think it would lead to things like that. But I just haven't seen much of that.
Gotcha. Okay. Very interesting perspective there. Yeah. And interesting to hear kind of like what's happening on that front. So now from like a market perspective and like a overall rate perspective, like as all this is kind of coming together and some of these improvements are happening, I mean, would someone see that like, okay, this building has, been upgraded, has, higher amperage from an electrical service perspective, for example, versus this building, which hasn't been upgraded. I mean, does that make a difference in terms of like the market rate that they would see from a lease rate perspective?
Not as, to me, that line is not as linear as you would think it would be, right? It should be. Yeah. A building should be that much more valuable if it's got the power that nobody else has. And I just haven't seen that really translate that much. I think where it's translated, again, from my point of view, is the buildings that have the capacity, the utility capacity, are the first ones to get leased. So where I've seen it translate is not necessarily as it relates to economics, but in timing. So if there's 5 buildings out there and one's got the power, generally speaking, there's that flight to quality, even if the end user, the company, doesn't necessarily need it, all things being equal. So I have not seen buildings rent for materially higher amounts just because of that. But again, it's case by case, right? So I'm talking more about like larger format, spaces that are, let's say, 300,000 square feet and north. And a lot of those were built, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, over the last, 5-7 years. And so I was more sort of thinking about that. When it comes down to like smaller spaces, you might see more of a sort of a financial impact on the lease rate for a smaller space that has the power.
Interesting. Okay, so more impact on smaller versus the larger. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's from my perspective. Yeah. That's what I see.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And that's a really interesting point there too about, like if it's a tenant that happens to be going into a building that has this upgrade, but doesn't necessarily needed, right? Is not looking for, like, how does that impact the rate? That's a pretty interesting point there. So
Yeah.
so now if we look at, these facilities and, if people are searching for a new facility or looking for that, I mean, what are some of your kind of top tips for companies? Like, what should they be looking for? What should they be considering, especially when it comes to like looking at a new facility versus like an older facility?
Number one, I think, and I couldn't, impress this enough, work with a broker I'm not a broker, but I just think like working with an advisor versus going alone, I think is very smart in this market. There are opportunities that are not widely out there necessarily that the brokers that are informed and engaged and active, know about or can find about. That's number one. Number two, I would start as early as possible. The later you start, the harder it is. I think this is sort of generic advice. Third, and this is not something we've talked about yet in the podcast, but if you don't mind, I'd like to bring it up.
Yeah, sure.
I think more now than ever, general operating expenses, and that is real estate taxes, common area maintenance or CAM, insurance, a property management fee, et cetera. All these sort of additional rental amounts, the triple net expenses, if you will, those I think have become more in focus. And I have seen, again, we are landlords. I'm not a broker, but we work with tenants every day, obviously. I've seen more of an emphasis from tenants on total occupancy costs and almost to the point, Kevin, where, we quote our rents, just like most landlords do on a per square foot basis. What are you asking for your building? We're asking, $20 a square foot triple net. And the response more and more I've seen is, that's great. What does that mean for me monthly? What's the monthly cost? And bake it all in for me. Not necessarily looking for like an apartment style rent where it's one figure every month, but just ballpark this for me, because real estate taxes have gone up considerably in a lot of these municipalities for industrial real estate. In some cases, these property taxes are, 2x where they were not that long ago.
Yeah.
So I've seen sort of more of an emphasis from tenants on total occupancy costs. So I would say like, look at everything from not just the rental rate perspective. And then in terms of site selection, building design, again, every company is so specific and their needs are so specific. It's hard for me to just put a couple of sound bites out there, but I would just say I've seen companies looking for, sort of the flight to quality, going for buildings that are more modern because they tend to have components that break down less. When you have components that break down less, it's just lower repair bills for you.
Yeah.
So when there's vacancy in the market and you're a tenant, I think it's important to look at new buildings, older buildings and older buildings that have been renovated. But I think there's been this sort of flight to quality to the new buildings and the ones that have been renovated, primarily from a cost and an affordability standpoint. And that is, I think companies are looking at this like, well, how old is the roof? How old is the HVAC equipment? How old is the electrical equipment? Because when and if some of these things break down, I as tenant or we as tenant are going to be responsible for part or all of those costs. So I think there's more of an emphasis, and I know this circles back to my previous point about occupancy costs and operating expenses, but I think there's more of a spotlight now. Tenants have become more sophisticated, and the ones that are working with consultants and advisors and material handling experts are really looking at the total cost of setting up the facility and then operating the facility. And it's no longer just about what is your rent.
Yeah.
And I've just seen more and more of that as time has gone by.
Yeah. Great points there, definitely. And I think, a lot of different factors to weigh in there. And I think it's very interesting to see, some of the differentiators there and some things that like, if you're looking for a building, right? If I'm somebody on the warehouse side of my business, right? And I'm thinking, probably number one, like, about just getting enough space, right? And now, thinking about like all these other factors too, I think is super important to highlight, right? Because you think about, your costs as you were talking, but then like ultimately what ends up being like your total cost at the end of the day, because it's, it's many things. It's not always just the face value price tag that you see.
Right.
There's all these other different things.
Yeah. When real estate taxes go up and when insurance goes up because there are more storms and floods and all these things, this all impacts the tenant. So, again, we don't have a lot of new million square foot buildings that we've built. We've built plenty of buildings, but most of what we own at the moment are older buildings that we've renovated. And the reason I bring that up is because we are scrutinized by the tenant community on our costs, on our operating expenses. So it's incumbent upon us as landlords of older buildings that have been renovated to keep them renovated, keep them updated, such that the key components break down less, right, less often. And that is, these expenses don't get passed through to these tenants. It's one way for us to, sort of compete with other landlords that own older buildings that have not renovated them, that have not appealed the property taxes, that have not changed out the HVAC equipment every, 5, 10, 15 years, so that you're giving tenants a good product that won't, break down, that is reliable. And so that's how we try to differentiate ourselves. And I think other landlords certainly do the same thing.
Yeah, fantastic. And great insights from you here, and really interesting to kind of dig into this and see how a lot of what's happening in the industry from like a internal perspective was inside the four walls is also now impacting kind of like those four walls and what comes along with those four walls and how to support it. So really interesting to hear what you're seeing out there and what you're feeling as well as someone that has these sites and developments as well. So really appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us about this. If people are interested in learning more or connecting with you, what's the best way to do that?
Sitexgroup.com. You can follow us on LinkedIn to hear about some of our latest activities. And we're just reach out the old-fashioned way. Pick up the phone and call me. I always love that. Yeah.
Fantastic. And we'll put that all at thenewwarehouse.com as well as in the show notes here so people can easily find it. So Blake, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.